Joran Wall had built a silence he could almost live within the shadow of the Broken Tooth Mountains. Then he found 5 orc slaves hidden in a ravine, starved, shackled, their jade skins split by fresh whip cuts, their captors drunk and loud. He freed them, led them to his cabin. 3 days later, the mercenary captain posted a bounty that drew 24 hardened trackers. The net is tightening and Joran faces a choice. Scatter into the killing cold or stand with the orcs he freed against a force that leaves no witnesses. Joran Wall knew the cost of doing the right thing. He'd served in the border campaigns, seen what happened to settlements that defied the mercenary companies. But when he found 5 orc prisoners in a ravine shackled, starved, their captors drunk, he made a choice. He cut them free. Now Captain Voss, the man who owned them, has put a price on his head. 24 trackers, each one a killer, are on his trail. And the 5 orcs he saved, they may be the only thing standing between him and a shallow grave. The Broken Tooth Mountains were a place that swallowed names. After the Ironwood campaigns, Joran Wall had walked into that range with a rifle, a pack mule, and a discharge paper that said he was no longer fit for service. What that paper really meant was that he had seen too much to ever fit back into civilian life. For 2 years, he built a silence. A one-room cabin of rough-hewn pine, a clean rifle above the door, a perimeter he walked each morning out of ingrained discipline. The war was over, but the war had carved channels in his brain that peace could not fill. He knew the sound of a twig snapping under a boot versus the crack of frost. He knew the difference between a deer and a two-legged predator crossing his ridge. And he knew, better than most, that the world below the timberline had not forgotten the bloodshed between human and orc. The mercenary companies that had grown fat on that war never disbanded. They rebranded. The Crimson Chain, a company that once fought for the border lords, now ran slaving operations in the low passes, capturing orcs from the scattered clans and selling them to mines, private armies, or anyone with enough coin. The war had ended with no real victory, just exhaustion, leaving the frontier in a state of permanent lawlessness. The orc clans were broken, their warriors dead or scattered, their civilians easy prey for men like Captain Voss. Voss was a career killer, a man who had risen through the ranks not by courage but by cruelty. He understood that fear was a currency, and he spent it lavishly. His way stations dotted the ravines like tumors, each one a small hell where captured orcs waited for transport. Joran knew this. He knew the risk of crossing the Crimson Chain. But the man who had once been a scout in the most brutal campaign of the Ironwood Wars had not forgotten that not all orcs were monsters. Some had fought with honor, some had shown mercy, some had been civilians caught in a slaughter that had no sides, only survivors. 3 days before the bounty went out, Joran rode into the low passes to trade pelts. The winter had been hard, his supplies thin. He took an old hunting trail, a path no map recorded, one his own feet had carved. That trail led him past a hidden ravine, and in its shadow he heard laughter, the ugly, wet laughter of drunk men. He dismounted, crept to the edge, and looked down. 5 orcs, skin the color of pale jade, were chained to iron stakes in the frozen mud. Their backs were a lattice of fresh whip cuts. A fire burned in the center of the camp, and around it, 4 guards passed a jug of contraband wine. The math was simple. The guards were careless, the orcs were helpless, and Joran had a rifle and the element of surprise. The moral math was something else entirely. Every instinct honed by war told him to walk away. You don't start a fight with a mercenary company over a handful of enemy prisoners. But Joran had spent 2 years in silence, and silence has a way of stripping away the noise of self-preservation until only the raw truth remains. He could not leave them. Not like that. Not when he knew what came next. He waited until the guards were deep in their cups, their weapons propped against a rock. Then he moved. Quick, quiet, precise. He cut the chains with a pair of bolt cutters from his pack, the rasp of metal on iron swallowed by the wind. The orcs did not cry out. They were too weak, too broken, but their eyes, especially the eyes of the female warrior in the center, tracked him with a wary, predatory calculation. She had a scar that ran from brow to jaw, and her gaze held the cold fire of someone who had not yet surrendered. He led them up the hunting trail, a path so narrow and steep that no horse could follow. They climbed for hours, the orcs stumbling but silent, their bare feet leaving bloody prints in the snow. By dawn, they reached the cabin. Joran gave them food, blankets, and the only dry floor he had. The female warrior, whose name he would later learn was Greca, watched him with a look that said she was measuring him for a fight or an alliance. She had not yet decided which. He gave her a single instruction: stay inside. For 2 days nothing happened. The orcs healed. Greca began to speak, her voice low and rough like stones grinding. She told him they were from the Stonehide clan, what remained of it. The mercenaries had raided their last holdout, killed the elders, taken the survivors. She was a shield sister, a warrior, and she had a debt to settle with Captain Voss. Joran listened, but he also watched the tree line. His perimeter was still intact, but the air had changed. A pressure like before a storm. On the third day, the storm broke. A rider came down the trade road, posting a parchment at the crossroads. The bounty was for one Joran Wall, wanted alive or dead for the theft of 5 orc slaves, property of the Crimson Chain. The reward was 500 gold crowns, a sum that could buy a farm or a year of drink. The notice also carried a special warning: any settlement that harbored the fugitive would be burned. Captain Voss was not just recovering stolen property, he was making an example. By nightfall, 24 trackers had answered the call. They came from every outpost between the mountains and the coast, bounty hunters, ex-soldiers, and the kind of men who carried the ears of their kills on a string. They brought hounds bred for the cold, massive, brindled beasts that could follow a scent through 3 days of snowfall. The manhunt had begun, and the net was drawing tight. Joran saw the first sign at sunset. A distant gleam on the ridge, binoculars. He knew the pattern. The trackers would set a perimeter, then push inward, driving their prey toward a kill zone. The cabin was no longer a refuge. It was a trap. He turned back to the door where Greca stood, her scar pale in the dying light. Behind her, the other 4 orcs were on their feet for the first time, makeshift weapons in hand. A pickaxe handle, a heavy chain, a fire-hardened branch. Greca met his eyes. There was no hesitation in her voice. "We fight," she said. The question was not whether they would stand, but how long they could hold. Because the trackers had numbers, hounds, and time. And Joran knew, with the certainty of a man who had spent 2 years waiting for the other boot to drop, that the first shot would be fired before dawn. The first shot came an hour before dawn. It punched through the cabin's only window, splintering the frame and burying itself in the back wall above the hearth. Joran had been awake, sitting in the dark with his rifle across his knees, waiting for the exact sound. He did not flinch. He rolled to the floor, pressed his back against the log wall, and counted. 1 shot, a single marksman on the north ridge. That was not an assault. That was an invitation. A prod to see if he was foolish enough to fire back and reveal his position. He stayed silent. Behind him, Greca had not moved from her crouch near the door. She held a heavy iron chain wound around her fist, and her eyes were fixed on the window, not with fear, but with the clinical detachment of a warrior calculating angles. She had done this before, many times, in conditions worse than this. Joran saw it in the way she placed her body between the window and the other 4 orcs, all of them pressed flat against the floor, breathing hard but quiet. The hounds began to bay. The sound rolled up from the timberline, a chorus of deep, hungry voices. The trackers were releasing them into the wind, letting them catch the scent of orc blood and human sweat that clung to the cabin like a signal fire. This was the pattern Joran knew from the war. Hounds to panic the prey, then a flanking team to cut off retreat. He had 2 rifles, 50 rounds, a single grenade left over from his campaign days, and 5 half-starved orcs. The math did not favor longevity, but the cabin was built well, set against a granite outcropping that protected the rear, with a single approach through a narrow clearing. A bottleneck. He had chosen this spot 2 years ago precisely because it was defensible. He had just never imagined he would be defending it with a company of Stonehide orcs. Greca spoke without turning. "The one on the ridge, he is not a shooter, he is a caller. The real attack comes from the east through the dry creek bed." Joran turned his head. "How do you know?" She tapped her nose. "The wind shifted. I smell iron. 3, maybe 4 men moving below the scent line. They are using the hounds as a distraction." Joran had known scouts who could read the wind like a map, but they were all dead or retired. This orc female, who had been a whipped slave 3 days prior, was giving him tactical intelligence with the calm of a veteran sergeant. He filed that away. He did not ask questions. He simply adjusted his sightline to cover the creek bed and waited. The attack came exactly as Greca predicted. 3 trackers burst from the dry creek bed, dark shapes against the snow, moving fast and low. Joran fired twice, the first shot catching the lead tracker in the leg, the second splintering the stock of the man's rifle. The man went down screaming. The other 2 veered, one rolling behind a stump, the other firing blind. His shots went wide, tearing into the logs. Greca was at the door before Joran could stop her. She flung it open, hurled her iron chain with a force that seemed impossible for her starved frame, and caught the second tracker around the neck. Chain jerked taut, and the man's head snapped back with a sound like a wet branch breaking. He crumpled, his finger still pulling the trigger, emptying his magazine into the dirt. The third tracker retreated, dragging his wounded comrade back into the tree line. Silence returned, thick and heavy. Greca closed the door. The other orcs stared at her. One of them, a young male whose whip cuts were still seeping, whispered something in their guttural tongue. She answered with a single sharp syllable that shut him up. Joran exhaled. "That was a sergeant's call," he said. "What you just did, sergeant or higher." Greca looked at him. The firelight caught the deep scar on her jaw, turning it silver. "I was a war leader of the Stonehide," she said, as if that explained everything. And it did. The Stonehide were the elite infantry of the old orc clans. Their war leaders had been trained by the border lords themselves before the war soured. That meant Greca had formal military training, not just tribal brawling. She was a professional. Joran felt a flicker of something he had not felt in years, the cold, clean math of tactical possibility. They might not be as outmatched as he had thought, but the respite did not last. From the ridge, a voice called down, amplified by a crude megaphone. The voice was smooth, almost pleasant, with the polished cadence of a man who enjoyed his work. "Joran Wall, you killed 2 of my men. That will cost you. Captain Voss wants you alive, but he didn't say undamaged. Throw out the orcs and you walk. Refuse, and we burn you out by noon. You have 10 minutes to decide." Joran recognized that voice. It belonged to a man named Kellen Marsh, a former intelligence officer turned bounty hunter, infamous for his ability to extract information from prisoners before they died. Marsh had a reputation for keeping his word when it suited him, and for breaking it when it was more entertaining. Joran had met him once in a field hospital after the siege of Dornth, where Marsh had been visiting wounded soldiers not to comfort them, but to interrogate them about troop movements. The man's presence meant that Voss was not just sending trackers. He was sending a professional who could think, adapt, and plan. They were no longer dealing with hired muscle. They were facing a tactical mind. Joran used the 10 minutes well. He had Greca and the others move the heavy table against the front wall to create a firing position. He set up a secondary shooting blind in the loft, accessible by a ladder, where he could take out anyone who tried to flank from the higher ground. He distributed his limited ammunition, giving the pickaxe to the young male, the chain to Greca, and the fire-hardened branch to an older female who moved with a limp. The fourth orc, a silent male with no visible weapon, simply sat in the corner, his eyes closed, breathing in a slow, deliberate rhythm that Joran did not have time to analyze. Then Marsh's voice came again. "Time up." The first Molotov struck the roof. The bottle shattered, spreading liquid fire across the pine shingles. Flames licked at the ceiling, filling the cabin with orange light and the smell of burning pitch. One of the orcs cried out, but Greca silenced him with a look. Joran grabbed a wool blanket, soaked it in the water bucket, and threw it onto the flames before they could spread. He stamped them out, the heat searing his hands. Then another bottle hit the side wall, and another. Marsh was going to burn them out piece by piece. Joran realized the flaw in his defensive plan. He could not stay inside a wooden cabin that was on fire. He had to move, and Marsh knew it. "The creek bed is open," Greca said, reading his mind. "If we go east, they will cut us down. The ridge is heavily covered. The only way is out the front through the clearing toward the tree line. They have a shooter on the north ridge, so we will lose at least 2 before we reach cover." Joran's mind raced through the same calculations she was making. She was right. The clearing was a kill zone, but there was another option. A route he had prepared 2 years ago, not for this exact situation, but out of the same paranoid instinct that had kept him alive through 3 campaigns. He moved to the back room, shoved aside the woodpile, and revealed a stone slab in the floor. "Tunnel," he said, "leads 20 yards to a storm cellar hidden in the boulder field. From there, a goat trail that cuts behind the north ridge. They'll never see us." The orc stared at him. Grekka's eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, but with the grudging respect of one professional recognizing another's contingency plan. "You build this alone?" she asked. "2 winters," he said. "I had time." They moved fast. Joran pulled the trapdoor, and one by one the orcs descended into the damp, black tunnel. The silent male went last, and as he passed, his eyes snapped open and he spoke for the first time. His voice was a whisper cracked with disuse, but the words were clear, spoken in perfect, unaccented common tongue. "Captain Voss does not want the slaves back. He wants us dead. Because I am not a slave. I am Varkun, chief archivist of the Stonehide. I carry the proof of the Crimson Chain's collusion with the governor's office in the massacres of Thornwood. The chain we were shackled with is not iron. It is the only copy of the ledgers, pressed into the metal itself. Voss will burn this mountain to ash to destroy it." The revelation hit Joran like a physical blow. The manhunt was not about property. It was not about making an example. It was about a conspiracy that reached from the frontier to the capital, and the 5 orcs he had freed were carrying the only evidence. No wonder the trackers were so determined. No wonder Marsh was here. This changed everything. Joran looked at the silent orc, the archivist, and then at Grekka, who was already pulling the stone slab back into place. "Then we don't scatter," Joran said. "We survive, and we get that chain to someone who can use it." The last word was swallowed by the rumble of the cabin collapsing above them, as Marsh's team began a full assault on an empty building. The tunnel plunged into darkness, and behind them the fire roared. But ahead, through the cold, damp earth, lay the goat trail, the ridge, and a chance, if they could stay ahead of the hounds, to turn the hunted into the hunters. The tunnel was a throat of frozen earth and old roots. They crawled single file through the pitch black, guided only by the rasp of Joran's breath ahead and the distant crackle of the cabin collapsing behind them. When his hand finally struck the wooden hatch of the storm cellar, he hesitated. Sound traveled strangely in the cold, and Marsh's trackers would be circling the clearing by now, counting bodies that weren't there. He lifted the hatch an inch. Cold air sliced through, clean and sharp. No voices. No boots. He pushed it open fully and pulled himself out into a nest of granite boulders, the sky above still bruised with the last of the night. One by one, the orcs emerged. Grekka came second, her chain still wrapped around her fist. The archivist Varkun came last, clutching the iron shackle that still dangled from his wrist, the shackle that contained a ledger worth more than all the gold in Captain Voss's coffers. They moved along the goat trail, a path so narrow that a misstep meant a 60-foot tumble into jagged rock. The trackers' hounds were baying again, but the sound was confused, circling the burning cabin. Marsh would soon discover the tunnel. They had minutes, not hours. Joran led them west, away from the known passes, deeper into the Broken Tooth range where the maps gave out and only memory served. His memory was good. He had spent 2 winters learning every deadfall, every thin ledge, every cave that held warmth. But he had not planned for a party of 6, 2 of them wounded, one of them carrying the most dangerous secret on the continent. The limp of the older female grew worse. Her name was Hura, and she had been a cook in the Stonehide hold before the Crimson Chain burned it. She said nothing, but each step pressed a hiss of pain through her teeth. Grekka moved to support her, but Hura shook her off. "Save your strength, war leader. My legs are old, the chain is not." Behind them, the baying changed pitch. The hounds had found the tunnel entrance. Joran heard Kellen Marsh's voice, calm and magnified, echoing up from the burning yard. "There in the boulder field, send the dogs east. Cut them off at the ravine." Marsh was reading the terrain, predicting their route. He knew the mountain too. That was the cold fact settling into Joran's chest. They were not being chased by amateurs. They were being hunted by a man who thought 3 steps ahead, and every step Joran took was a step Marsh had already considered. Greca pulled him aside as the trail widened into a small plateau. "We need to split the scent," she said. "2 of us go south, draw the hounds, while the rest continue west with the archivist." It was tactically sound. It was also a death sentence for the decoys. Joran looked at the others, the young male with the pickaxe, the silent male who had not yet spoken, Hura the cook, Varkan the archivist. "No," he said. "We stay together, we're not trading lives, not like that." Greca's scar twisted. "If we are all dead by sunrise, the chain dies with us. Voss wins." Joran met her eyes. "Then we don't die. There's a mine shaft 2 miles west, sealed during the war. I used it for storage. We can defend it." Greca held his gaze for a beat, then nodded. It was not agreement. It was the acceptance of a warrior who knew that both plans were bad, and the only thing worse than a bad plan was no plan. They pushed on. The sky began to lighten in the east, a pale gray bleeding through the pines. That was when Hura fell. Not a stumble, a collapse, her injured leg finally giving out. She landed hard on the frozen ground, the breath knocked out of her, and when she looked up, her eyes were not afraid. They were resolute. "I will slow them," she said. "Take the child." The child was a word she used for Varkan, though the archivist was fully grown. It was a term from the old clan tongue, meaning someone precious, someone to be protected. Varkan started to protest, but Hura cut him off with a sharp gesture. "I have cooked for war leaders and sung the death songs. My voice is still strong." She pulled herself upright against a boulder, gripping her fire-hardened branch like a spear. Greca did not argue. She touched Hura's forehead, a gesture of deep respect, and then turned and continued west. The young male hesitated. Greca grabbed his arm and pulled him along. The last thing Joran saw of Hura was her silhouette against the lightening sky, a lone orc woman standing on a goat trail waiting for the hounds. The barking intensified. Then a single sharp cry cut off abruptly. Then silence. Joran did not look back again. He filed the sound away, along with all the other sounds he had learned to bury, and focused on the path ahead. They reached the mine shaft as the first true light of dawn touched the peaks. The entrance was a boarded-up opening in a cliff face, half hidden by a rock slide. Joran pried the boards loose and they slipped inside into the cold, dry dark. The air smelled of old stone and bat droppings. Deeper in the mine, Joran had stored supplies. Lanterns, a few cans of food, a water barrel. He lit a lantern, and in its glow Varkan sank to his knees, his chest heaving. He had been silent the entire trek, conserving every breath, but now he spoke. "The shackle," he rasped. "It is not just a ledger, it is a cipher. The chain links are imprinted with a code that can only be read by a specific crystal. The crystal was hidden in the Stonehide archives. I brought it with me. It is here in this mine." He reached into a tier in his ragged tunic and produced a small, cloudy crystal, no larger than a thumbnail. "Without it, the chain is just iron. With it, anyone can read the true names." Joran stared at the crystal. "What true names?" Varkan looked up, his eyes ancient and exhausted. "The massacre at Thornwood was not just the Crimson Chain. It was ordered from the capital. The governor's personal seal is on those ledgers, and not only the governor. 3 senators, the commander of the border garrison, and a dozen wealthy merchants who financed the operation. They wanted the orc lands cleared for mining. The massacre was the first step. The second step was to use the outrage to pass a full extermination decree, labeling all orc clans as hostiles to be hunted. The Crimson Chain was the weapon. The governor was the hand. And I have the proof." The weight of those words settled over the mine like a second darkness. Joran had known the border was corrupt. He had seen things during the war that made him sick, but this was not wartime chaos. This was high-level orchestration, a conspiracy of profit dressed in official seals. If Varkan's chain reached the world, it would bring down a government, which meant that the government would bring down an army to stop them. As if summoned by the thought, a voice drifted down through the air shaft above. Kellen Marsh, his tone as pleasant as ever, but now carried by the natural echo of the mine. "Joran Wall, you've led us a fine chase, but this mine has only one entrance and we have it surrounded. I've brought some friends. Real soldiers this time, the governor's own. They're very interested in what you've been carrying." There was a pause, then the sound of boots above. not just leather but hard military soles. Come out with the chain, and I give you my word you'll be treated fairly. Stay in there and we seal you in, permanently. Greca moved to the entrance, peering through a gap in the boards. She pulled back, her face grim. He is not lying. There are at least 30 of them, uniformed, with a heavy machine gun. They were trapped. The mine had one way out, and it was covered by overwhelming firepower. Joran looked at the grenade still clipped to his belt. One grenade wouldn't break a siege, but it might open another door. He raised the lantern and studied the far end of the shaft. The mine had collapsed during the war, he remembered. The back wall was loose rubble supported by old timbers. If he placed the grenade correctly, he might blow through into an old ventilation shaft that he knew ran parallel to this tunnel. A shaft that surfaced 100 yards down the mountainside in the middle of a dense deadfall. It was a desperate gamble. The blast could bring the whole roof down on them. But the alternative was a firing squad. He explained the plan quickly. Greca's eyes lit with understanding. She positioned the others behind a thick support pillar while Joran wedged the grenade into the rubble, pulled the pin, and dove back. The explosion was a deafening thunder that shook the mountain. Rock crashed and dust filled the air, blotting out the lantern. When the rumbling stopped, Joran crawled forward through the choking haze. A hole, jagged and narrow, had opened into a dark space beyond. Cold air poured through. That was the air shaft. It was clear. He turned to pull the others through, but a voice stopped him. Varkun, pinned under a fallen timber, his legs crushed. He coughed blood, but his hand was steady as he held out the chain and the crystal. Take it. Get to Stonebridge. Find the journalist named Alara Venn. She published the first reports on Thornwood. She will know what to do. Greca took the chain reverently. Varkun's eyes closed. He was still breathing, but barely. Joran lifted the timber as much as he could, but it was no use. Varkun was dying. Outside, orders were being shouted. The soldiers were moving to the entrance, wary of the blast. They had seconds. Greca pressed her forehead to Varkun's, a war leader's farewell, and then they crawled through the hole, leaving the archivist in the dark. The air shaft was narrow, wet, and steep. They climbed upward, hand over hand, the cold rock tearing at their fingers. Behind them, gunfire erupted as the soldiers stormed the mine. They would find Varkun soon, dead or alive. They would find the tunnel. Joran pulled himself out of the shaft into a tangle of fallen pines, the deadfall so thick that even daylight was dim. The others followed, Greca, the young male, and the silent male. 4 of them left out of 5. The hounds were still baying, but the sound was distant now, confused by the explosion. Greca held up the chain. It gleamed dully in the morning light. On it, invisible to the naked eye, were the names of the men who had ordered a genocide. In her other hand, the crystal. 4 of them left, and a dead man's mission. The town of Stonebridge lay 7 miles through hostile territory, down a mountain pass that would be swarming with patrols by noon. And somewhere in Stonebridge, a journalist named Alara Venn had no idea that the most explosive story in the continent's history was crawling toward her through the snow, carried by a broken veteran, an orc war leader, 2 traumatized survivors, and the iron memory of a slaughtered people. The next few hours would decide whether that story ever saw the light, or whether it died with them in the cold, buried under the same silence that had covered the graves of Thornwood. The deadfall was a frozen graveyard of ancient pines, their trunks crisscrossed like the ribs of some vast buried beast. Joran led them through it at a pace that was not quite a run and not quite a walk. The steady, ground-eating shuffle of soldiers, too exhausted to sprint but too hunted to rest. Greca was beside him, the chain wrapped around her forearm now, the crystal tucked into a fold of her tunic. The young male, whose name was Orek, carried the pickaxe like a talisman. The silent one, who had still not spoken, moved with an eerie lightness despite a gash on his scalp that had matted his hair black with dried blood. 4 of them left. 4 against 30 soldiers, a bounty hunter, and a conspiracy that stretched to the capital. They emerged from the deadfall onto a logging road, the snow here packed down by recent wagon traffic. The town of Stonebridge lay in the valley below, a cluster of slate roofs and chimney smoke, looking peaceful and oblivious. Joran had been there once years ago to sell pelts. He remembered the newspaper office on the main street, a narrow brick building with a sign that read the Stonebridge Ledger ***. That was where Alara Ven worked. That was their objective. But between the tree line and the town lay 2 miles of open ground, frozen fields, stone walls, no cover. And the patrols would be pushing down from the pass by now, fanning out to seal all approaches. Greca knelt and studied the valley through the gap in a collapsed stone wall. The town gate is guarded, 2 men in militia coats. They will be looking for us. Joran nodded. They'll have descriptions, a human veteran and 5 orcs. We can't walk in together. He paused, thinking. I know another way. The old mill on the river. It connects to the cellar of the inn. From there, a back alley leads to the newspaper office, but someone has to draw the guards at the gate. Greca met his eyes. I will. Joran started to argue, but she cut him off with the same sharp syllables she'd used on Auric in the cabin. I am a war leader. I know how to be a distraction. Get the chain to the journalist. We will find you. There was no time for debate. The distant sound of baying hounds was growing louder again. Marsh had found the air shaft. Joran and the Silent One, who had to be a scout, Joran realized no one else moved that quietly took the chain and the crystal. Greca and Auric moved south, toward the main gate, deliberately making noise. Within minutes, a shout went up from the gate and Joran heard the distinctive crack of a rifle. Then another. He forced himself to keep moving. Greca knew what she was doing. He had to believe that. He and the silent orc slid down the embankment to the river, crossed the half-frozen water on a fallen log, and reached the old mill just as the sun cleared the eastern peaks. The mill was derelict, its water wheel still. They pried open a rotted hatch and dropped into the inn cellar, startling a cat that bolted up the stairs. The newspaper office was 100 yards up the alley. The silent orc pointed to the window of the asterisk ledger. Joran could see a woman inside, hunched over a desk piled with papers, her ink-stained fingers moving fast. That had to be Alara Ven. They slipped into the alley and Joran hammered on the back door. The woman opened it, her eyes widening at the sight of a wild-eyed veteran and a bleeding orc. Joran shoved the chain and the crystal into her hands. You're Alara Ven. You reported on the Thornwood massacre. This chain contains the proof of who ordered it. The governor, 3 senators, the garrison commander. You need to read it with this crystal now. There's no time, they're coming. Ven was a journalist to her bones. She didn't ask for credentials. She took the chain, held the crystal to the first link, and gasped. The crystal lit from within, projecting tiny lines of script onto the wall, names, dates, sums paid, orders given. She began to read, her face going pale. Then she grabbed a camera, a bulky apparatus with flash powder, and started photographing each link as she deciphered it. I need 10 minutes, she said. I can wire the story to the capital before they stop me. Joran and the silent orc took positions at the front and back doors. Outside, chaos was erupting. The diversion had worked. Soldiers were converging on the main gate where a fire had started. But Kellen Marsh was not fooled. Joran saw him appear at the end of the alley, flanked by 2 soldiers with drawn pistols. Marsh was no longer smiling. His coat was singed, his face smeared with ash from the mine explosion, but his voice was still calm. Joran, you've been a worthy opponent, but this ends now. Give me the chain and I'll let the others live. The governor has authorized a full lockdown. No wires leave the town. Your journalist friend can't send anything. Joran raised his rifle. You're lying, Marsh. You don't have the authority to lock down a town. Marsh's smile returned, thin and dangerous. I do when martial law is declared. The decree was signed an hour ago. The massacre at the mine has been blamed on orc insurgents. You're not a fugitive anymore, you're a terrorist, and your death will be entirely legal. He signaled and the soldiers advanced. But before they could fire, a shape dropped from the roof above, landing on the soldiers with the force of a falling boulder. Greca. She had circled around, scaled the building, and now her chain whipped out, disarming the first soldier before he could pull his trigger. The silent orc lunged from the doorway, blade in hand. He had picked up a fallen knife and engaged the second. Joran tackled Marsh before the bounty hunter could draw his own weapon. They crashed onto the cobblestones, and for a few savage seconds, it was hand-to-hand, no rules, just survival. Marsh was strong, trained, but Joran had the desperate fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. He pinned Marsh's gun hand and drove his fist into his jaw. The bounty hunter's head snapped back and he went limp. Inside the office, the telegraph key began to click. Venn was sending the story line by line even as the militia pounded on the front door. The Thornwood Massacre was ordered by Governor Aldrich, Senator Harrow, Senator Vance, and General Kest. Financial records confirm payment to the Crimson Chain. Proof attached. Stop the extermination decree before it's voted. The chain is the evidence. She sent it to 3 separate newsrooms in the capital, each one a failsafe. Then she pocketed the crystal and the chain, grabbed her camera plates, and followed Joran out the back door. They fled through the alleys as the town erupted behind them. The militia was divided, some loyal to the local mayor, who had received Venn's wire and was already demanding answers, others still following the governor's orders. The confusion bought them time. Joran led the group, Venn, Greca, the silent orc, and Orek, who had survived the gate diversion with a bullet graze, along the riverbank and into a cave he knew from a hunting trip. They hid there while the sun climbed to noon. The silent orc at last spoke. His name was Tarak. He was the last scout of the Stonehide, the one who had mapped the escape routes from the hold when the Crimson Chain attacked. He had not spoken because he had been holding onto a vow of silence until he saw the truth spread. "Now I have seen," he said, "and my vow is fulfilled." He looked at Greca and bowed his head. "The clan lives in you, war leader." The news broke in the capital by evening. Joran heard it from a farmer's radio that they passed while moving under cover of darkness. The governor was under arrest. The senators had fled, but the border garrison had been ordered to stand down. The extermination decree was dead before the vote. Captain Voss of the Crimson Chain was killed by his own men when they realized their paymasters were finished. The mercenary company disbanded within a week. The manhunt that had begun with a simple act of mercy had toppled a government. But it was not a clean victory. The archivist Varkon died in the mine. His body never recovered. Hura's sacrifice held the hounds long enough to save the group. Marsh, recovering from his beating, was arrested by the new judicial council and hanged for war crimes. Joran testified at his trial, reading a statement that Hura had written in her mind but never put on paper. Greca stood beside him in the courtroom, the chain, now a symbol, draped around her shoulders. Joran returned to the Broken Tooth Mountains, not to the cabin, which was ash, but to a new one, built with help from the Stonehide survivors who had come out of hiding. The land was no longer a frontier of lawlessness. The new government, pressured by the revelations, granted legal protection to the remaining orc clans and prosecuted the merchants who had funded the massacres. Ilara Venn won a journalism prize and continued to report on the long process of reconciliation. Tarak became the first orc liaison to the border guard. Orek trained as a healer, tending to the wounds of both species. And Greca, the war leader without a clan, found a new purpose, rebuilding the Stonehide from the scattered remnants, on a patch of land adjacent to Joran's new cabin. The surprising detail, the one that even Joran didn't learn until years later, was that the iron chain had one final secret. Embedded in the clasp, invisible without the crystal, was a personal letter from Varkon, written in the old clan script. It was addressed to the future, to whoever held the chain when the truth was finally known. It said, "This iron was forged from the armor of our fallen. It carries their spirits. When you read this, tell them we were not silent. Tell them we survived." Greca had the chain melted down and recast into 5 small pendants, one for each of the original prisoners and one for Joran Wall. They wore them on the day the first orc child was born on the Stonehide new land. And on that day, in a quiet valley between the mountains, the silence that Joran had spent 2 years building was finally, completely, and willingly broken. The story of Joran Wall and the 5 orc slaves could have ended in 100 different ways. Most of them would have been forgotten. A veteran who looked the other way. A massacre buried in a mine. A chain thrown into a fire. That is how history usually works. The powerful write the records and the inconvenient truths vanish. But occasionally, a single act of mercy fractures that pattern. Joran didn't free those prisoners because he had a plan. He freed them because he could not walk away. And that small, stubborn refusal to be silent triggered a cascade that reached from a frozen ravine all the way to the capital, bringing down men who thought they were untouchable. What lingers after this is the question of cost. Mercy is not free. Hera paid with her life. Varkon died in the dark, his final act handing over a chain. Grekka and Auric and Tarek carried scars that would never fully heal. Even Joran, who survived, lost the silence he had carefully built. But in losing it, he found something else: a community, a purpose, a reason to stay on the mountain not as a hermit but as a neighbor. The pendants they wore were not just symbols of survival. They were reminders that the truth, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. The chain that had bound them became the chain that bound a corrupt regime. In the years that followed, the Thornwood archives were opened. Other names emerged, other crimes. The reconciliation was slow and painful, as those things always are, but the precedent had been set. A single piece of evidence, protected by unlikely allies, could hold the powerful accountable. Joran never sought recognition. He went back to his cabin or the new one and walked his perimeter each morning. But now the perimeter was wider, including orc homesteads and a shared garden. Grekka became a negotiator between the clans and the new government. Tarek trained a generation of scouts who served both humans and orcs. Auric opened a clinic that treated anyone, regardless of species. And Alara then kept writing, because the story of how the chain was found was almost as important as what it contained. Before we go, if this story meant something to you, take a second to subscribe to the channel. It's free, it takes a moment, and it helps us bring more stories like this one to life. Tell us in the comments what you would have done in that ravine, faced with that choice. Would you have walked away, or would you have cut the chains? Your answer says something about who you are. And sometimes that answer changes the world.